Now we are going to formally start. So in fact, today is a very special day that we are honored to have Shri Dinesh Jagdale from MNRE, Shri Chintan Shahji from Ireda. He will join a little later, he said, after half an hour, so we'll shift a little bit. Dr. Anil Mishraji from UNIDO, Shri Manav Bansalji from SBI Capital, Shri Gaurav Kapoorji from DFID, and Shri Vivek Jainji from India Ratings and Research with us as esteemed speakers. Welcome, sir. And we all are here, especially to take the journey of Samanvay, Samvad, and Samadhan further, which we talked last time in the last webinar, which already started giving the result. In fact, we started doing the priority problems, listing down the priority problem. We started the proper dialogue with the ministry and also looking forward for the real solution. And in fact, this is also helping us to connect a lot of dots, but still a lot of dots are missing, and the dialogue must be kept intact. And this can't happen without properly thinking about a financial push to the whole Bio-CNG sector. And this was one of the main issues also put forward by the Satat LOI holders. So in fact, with this, I would like to invite Shri Dinesh Jagdale ji to take the journey further. In fact, he's driving the renewable energy sector with full energy by bringing the expertise of corporates. So with this, sir, I would like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gaurav. Hope I'm audible to all. Very warm welcome and a good afternoon on this lovely Saturday. We in spite of all this COVID scenarios hanging over us for the last 2.5 months, the progress that we have made in the sector in terms of creating a dialogue, understanding the sectorial issues, and then further trying to understand how to be together with the developers, with the regulators, with the policymakers, and of course, today is the day when we are trying to understand and decode the nuances of financing, which according to me is one of the biggest enabler that will bring this Bio-CNG aspect on the forefront. So good to have my fellow panelists, and I see wide representation from across sectors. So wonderful to talk to you all and listen to you today about your ideas and your keenness in terms of taking this sector ahead. From an MNRE perspective, all you are aware that program on waste to energy as a matter has been in the practice since last 3 years. But recently on 20th of February 2020, we came out with an amended program trying to ease out some of the procedures for applying CFA, and we are also trying to bring in an online version of the process so that it will be beneficial for all those who are very keen to avail the central finance assistance based on the condition precedents that we are mentioning. We have also added the MSW to power as an added element in our waste to energy program. So those who are really keen on going with the MSW to the power route also will get the central finance assistance from MNRE. So coming back to the biogas and the Bio-CNG aspect, of course, biogas is a ministerial program for last maybe 30 years now. Since the ministry started, biogas has been in the country in whatever fashion, whatever form it has. The small biogas plants has made an impact in the country livelihood program. There are more than 50 lakh biogas, small and medium-sized biogas plants that are running. And every day I come across certain success stories from the villages, from the rural areas, where we see that the acceptance is increasing. It is our duty now to create an enabling atmosphere and enabling environment to take that initiative further. So just to, while I was discussing with the association team and some of the stakeholders, and my colleague Chintan should be joining, we do realize and appreciate that unless and until there are certain innovative ways of financing, there are some stable, we understand the sector in totality, the mass movement will be difficult to come. And therefore, financing aspect was more critical whenever we discussed within my senior team in the MNRE, and they will agree that this has been a sector which required a lot of push. Just 2-3 days back, Honorable Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas took a review, and I was told that there are almost 501 LOIs that have been issued by various or have been signed by various oil companies. That's a remarkable figure. And this, when we talk or relate this to the amount of biogas, Bio-CNG they will be generating is around 1 million metric ton per annum, which translates to around 2,800 tons per day. So the intent is clear. And when we talk of intent, that means there is a sense of acceptability of the program. That acceptability depends on obviously many factors. And therefore, when we talk of that factor, we are here to now see how that finance factor will be getting enabled into this in this program. The other not so good story is that out of 501, only 35 have achieved financial closure, and that's the gap that we have to bridge by discussing and trying to address the concerns. And when I bring this point again back to the discussion point about what are the advantages, you must have heard Honorable Prime Minister talking about the 5 I's with the industry a few days back. And when we talk about the Bio-CNG program, it's an Atmanirbhar element which will make India really Atmanirbhar from a natural gas import perspective. I would just identify certain key elements. There are 9 certain elements which I thought this Bio-CNG program gives a benefit of. First, obviously, is the climate. That's the commitment to decarbonize the country's economy. So this particular Bio-CNG program addresses the climate issue, addresses the reduction in methane and CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Second is the need of energy. Now, energy, I mean, it's not only electricity. There are various forms of other energy that we need, whether it's steam, whether it's heat, or whether it's a vehicular transportation that enables conveyance. So it addresses the need of energy. The biggest important aspect, which I think, is the agriculture. And when I talk of agriculture, I talk about the circular economy that this Bio-CNG program gives. It's the improving the nutrients of the soil is today a biggest task that we should take. And the organic slurry that these programs after the methanation is arrived definitely has higher NPK values. I have been told by my colleagues in the Ministry of Agriculture that the recognition of this bioorganic slurry is going to be announced very soon. The Honorable Minister has approved the recognition in the FCO list, and very soon it is gone for the legal weighting of the total scheme, and therefore the announcement of inclusion of bioorganic slurry in the FCO order, very soon it should be announced. Obviously, the forex, we are replacing, or we are trying to replace the import contents, or trying to reduce the forex reserve, forex that India basically spends on importing natural gas. The next is the employment. It creates, when we talk about distributed number of Bio-CNG plants across the country, we definitely create employment. And that is the biggest task that we need to address in this post-COVID scenario, is trying to generate employment. And through this ministerial program with MNRE and MOPNG, we definitely are creating employment. 30 to 40 people at least per plant is what we expect, right from the collection, distribution, transportation of the waste or the resource, and then operation and maintenance and the distribution of the gas. Then is the health. So India spends huge amount of money on the health sector. By improving health, decreasing fatality caused on account of pollution is another element which this program indirectly brings in. So health improvement is one of the success of this, will be a success of this program. Entrepreneurship. The small plants will create entrepreneurship ability, and that is where the nuances of finance will have to be taught. How can we build and how can we support the entrepreneurship in this country by engaging them, whether it's whether it's manufacturing, whether it's supply chain, whether it's distribution of gas, whether it's basically trying to bring in RESCO models, trying to supply the gas in terms of RESCO opportunities. All that entrepreneurship ability will come, and that absolutely the RE wind and solar success stories will be also replicated in the Bio-CNG program as well. And of course, which is important, is the economic return. And that's where I think the banks will be taking the equity, private equity, the debt, the NBFCs or the FIs will be considering what is the economic return on the investment that I would be getting at the end of the day. And based on that, we have seen that there are certain challenges that were discussed. One was the rate, the longevity of the agreement, what are the gas purchase agreement looks like, what is that is required to further reduce the risk on the money that is being invested. But all that has been being addressed. Some is being addressed, some will be addressed very soon, because the intent from the government of India is very clear that this Bio-CNG program gives you all those 5 I's which Honorable Prime Minister talked about, whether it's intent, inclusion, investment, infrastructure, and innovation. So here, the 2 elements which we should talk about today is one of the investment, and second is the innovation that the entrepreneurs can bring in to de-risk the investments that will come into the sector. So with this opening remarks, I think I'm very keen to understand from all my colleagues today. We have Dr. Anil Mishra, we have Chintan, we have Shri Manav Bansalji, Gauravji, and Vivek from a rating perspective. Very keen to hear you out, and of course all the attendees who have joined, very keen to take on Q&As later on, and I'm sure some of your questions will be answered today. And we see a lot of entrepreneurs we are coming in to join us in this decarbonizing economy of India. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks a lot, sir, for the insightfulness, and it was really great that you talk from all this perspective, because we also always say, sir, biogas is not just biogas; it's a lot more. Whether it is from the climate change perspective, what you said, or from bio-slurry perspective, or forex expenditure saving perspective, or employment generation perspective, or health, or entrepreneurship, or economic return, or even waste to energy, or women empowerment, what not, in fact. So basically, we are targeting multi-dimensional problem with one solution. So definitely, we really need to stick to the goal. And there is always there is a saying that a goal without its plan is just a wish. So I think we are here, or we have settled down here right now to talk about this plan only. And without a proper financial push, nothing can go further. So, sir, we'll be taking some question and answer at the end as well. We'll be compiling it and we'll be, asking you, but that will happen at the end. And with this, sir, I would like to now request Dr. Anil Mishra ji. Anil Mishra ji is already a well-known figure, but just to give a couple of lines about him. So he is working as National Project Manager at UNIDO, coordinating 2 strategic projects to demonstrate innovations in the number 1, deployment of CST technologies for process heat applications, and number 2, conversion of industrial organic waste to energy through biomethanation of mixed substrate. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Gaurav. Good afternoon to all the panelists and participants. My pleasure to be here among all of you. I have switched off my camera because the internet seems to be a little unstable today. I'm speaking from my home. UN offices are still closed. And before I start, I want to wish Mr. Jagdale a happy birthday. He has his birthday today.
Thank you, Doctor. Actually, it was yesterday. So I'm lucky to have this birthday on the Environment Day. So it's good, and thank you. Thank you for the wishes.
Welcome. We are in the time, so I can't ask you where is the party. Anyway, so Gaurav has brought me into a conference, into a webinar which talks about financing. I'm not a finance person, So let's see. And you have given me a topic which is purely related to finance, but I'm going to speak and share some of my observations from the perspective of the project which UNIDO is implementing. Of course, it is the sector of which we are talking today. UNIDO's project started about 4 years back, and it focuses on biomethanation technology and aims to contribute to JEF climate change strategic objective, those who are aware, basically promoting investment in renewable technologies. Initially, we had selected 4 SME industrial sectors. We thought UNIDO could make a intervention and establish some demonstration projects in these 4 sectors, which are basically cattle farming, poultry, sugar, fruit, food, and vegetable processing. One of the major activities we started in this project was the assessment of organic waste availability in the industrial sectors. This study has been carried out at a district level for the 4 waste types, which I have mentioned in 4 states only. For your information, these 4 types of waste form the majority of the waste availability in the country. And we thought we will choose the 4 states which have the highest potential for conversion of these waste into energy through biomethanation route. But in the last meeting of the steering committee, we were requested by the ministry to extend the study to all the states, which we are doing now. So availability of the organic waste from industrial sectors will be available after a few months at the district level in all the states. The second important thing we are implementing in this project is the development of a new financing scheme, and for which we have partnered with IREDA, Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency. We would be providing some funds to IREDA. Using these funds, IREDA would be able to reduce the interest rates. So subvention of interest rate for biomethanation projects. But here there is a catch. The focus is on innovation. Because there was a question that since subsidies and incentives are already provided, why there was a need for another financial instrument to promote these projects. We said innovations make any project more expensive, and project developers and beneficiaries and others would be reluctant to include these innovations, and therefore they need to be supported. So I will be talking about these innovations at different points during my brief talk of 10 minutes now. So we all are aware that we have currently ongoing 4 schemes, 2 by Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, which is basically SATAT and the National Policy of Biofuels, and 2 programs by Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, that is Biogas program and Waste to Energy program. Biogas program perhaps is the oldest program, which started many years back, and we still remember a biogas project in the community in a village, Mithan, in Gujarat, which I believe is still functioning. 500 tons of waste is processed, and the biogas is supplied through underground pipes to households, managed by a managing committee on a cooperative model, including women entrepreneurs. The note which was circulated by Gaurav already mentions very important points. One is the fragmentation of the, what I should say, the handling of the subject. Different ministries are involved and different departments, different programs are run from different places. Perhaps there may be a problem of non-harmonization of this interministerial policy frameworks. And that is one of my points, how to bring harmony among different schemes which are run by or which are governed by different ministries, because fragmentation of anything leads to some difficulties. One of the innovation which has been recognized in the project is the application of Bio-CNG and innovative business models for this, which is relatively a new application of biogas, whether it has to be injected into the gas grid or it is supplied cascades or in different forms. Now, if we go a little bit out of the UNIDO project, biogas, as I mentioned, is one of the oldest programs, has been happening. We have excellent projects. Now look at the Hyboval Dairy Complex in Ludhiana, the project implemented in 2004, where manure was collected from 80,000 cattle, generates 6 million kilowatt hours, 6 million units of clean renewable energy per year, produces 47 tons per day of organic fertilizer. So we have many, many examples. Another example I can quote is a large biodegradable waste biogas bottling and fertilizer plant in Nanded in Gujarat, which was commissioned 3 years back in 2018, fully automated with SCADA controls, continuous stirred tank reactor technology, and 240 tons per day of mixed feedstock, cow dung, fruit, vegetable waste, potato waste, chicory, press mud, etc., etc. Project has a digester volume of 21,000 cubic meter, and the entire project had a cost of $2.5 million US. Another More Bioenergy Limited in Jin in Haryana. So I think the second point which I want to bring here, we have successful biogas projects, Bio-CNG projects already now. Can we look into the business models and their ownership structures? There was a recently published report by EPA of the United States, which says market opportunities for anaerobic digestion of livestock and agro-industrial waste in India. This study had 3 countries, focused on 3 countries, and India was one of them. And this report covers the most relevant policies which are currently ongoing, incentives which are provided that support biogas development in India today. So I think the point I want to bring is there is a need to look into the successful business models, how they have been functioning, what are the ownership structures, and then get lessons from them to be duplicated in future. Another innovation which we would recognize in our projects would be feedstock pre-processing and management, including modification of physical or chemical properties of organic waste to increase their shelf life and also to minimize hydraulic retention time. We can also look for new models of multiple waste transportation and storage facilities. I am aware that something is happening also on this front. Companies from Europe are trying to establish these mechanisms for year-long availability of the feedstock through collection, formation of the feedstock depots, particularly, for example, the baling technology for the agricultural waste, etc., etc. Now, talking about business models, I also want to mention UNIDO had taken a delegation last year to Europe to study various business models. all the players. Next innovation is value addition of the digestate or manure development of organic fertilizers. I know that management of manure has been an issue, and Mr. Jagdale just mentioned that was it Ministry of Agriculture which is coming up with a new regulation, which I think it is a very good news if some mechanism comes where biomanure is able to replace the chemical manure, and there are some rules and regulations which are governing this sector. That would be a new thing. Now, the Satat scheme of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, I came to know, I learned that more than 400 LOIs have been issued for the compressed biogas plants. What I could propose and suggest maybe a survey among the recipients of all the LOIs, which may become useful to check if they are facing any issues in the realization of the biogas plants. Are there financial issues? Are there policy gaps? And then to see how these issues can be addressed. Talking of financing, the note already has mentioned that financial institutions and the banks especially would view biogas projects as high-risk projects. And the note which Gaurav circulated already mentioned the reluctance of financial lenders to expose the credit towards this industry. Can something be done to reduce the risk or to allow the financial institutions to feel more comfortable about the biogas projects? On a very, very small scale, what UNIDO is trying to do, the scheme is still under development. The scheme documents are being reviewed by the legal departments. So what we discussed and what we agreed with the IREDA is that the small part of the fund, which is being provided by UNIDO project to IREDA for the subvention of the interest rate, can be kept, can be reserved for the risk mitigation, for the risk coverage. Can such a facility be created at the national level? I'm aware that SIDBI had some time back, I think a few years back, had a scheme of risk mitigation with assistance from World Bank, and which I think was mainly used for energy efficiency projects. To my knowledge, no renewable energy project was considered under this facility. So this is the third point which comes to my mind, risk mitigation and giving more comfort to the financial institution or to the banks, which otherwise would be willing to support for biogas projects or to lend for biogas projects. Then other innovations, of course, which we would recognize in UNIDO are basically plant equipment and design. What are the latest developments in anaerobic digesters or reactors, such as use of special materials, techniques of construction for reduction in construction time and installation time, new designs which enable co-digestion of multiple waste heat recovery, etc. Plus biogas scrubbing, upgradation technologies, improvement in the existing technologies, increasing methane concentration in the output, and minimize operation and maintenance costs, as well as increase the system life. And finally, microbiological processes primarily include demonstration of microbial culture or the inoculum to enhance the biogas production. So basically, these are the things we are trying to do very small scale. And if I summarize my observations, I would suggest a study of the existing plants, large plants, which give us lessons, what was positive in those projects, what was negative, and we can learn a lot of lessons, can be circulated. Also, a survey among the winners of the LOIs from the oil marketing companies. I think more than 400 LOIs make a sense if the if the recipients of these LOIs are being surveyed, and to ask, are there any bottlenecks further for the realization of these biogas plants? And my last point relates to capacity building exercises on a regular basis. UNIDO has a small money in the project, and we will soon be initiating some training programs, some capacity building programs, and we would be looking for institutions. The terms of reference are being developed. We will get the approval of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy under TOR, and then we will try to start these training programs with maybe it would perhaps make sense to start with some existing training centers or training institutes which have otherwise the basic facilities for training, but a new knowledge has to be added to their own capacity. So these were my thoughts. Thank you very much for listening, but I'll be here and will participate later on if there are questions on these observations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Mishra. That was really, really good to hear. In fact, we fully agree about your successful case study point, about your risk mitigation one, and all other things, including the soft skill. And in fact, the next webinar series, we are going to concentrate on successful case studies only because, we keep hearing about a lot of failure, but at the same time, we need to understand about the successful cases as well, even though those are few. But nevertheless, we need to study it properly. We always say that we need to study it from technical side, from financial side, and also from social engineering side. But definitely we'll take this further, and we'll anyway, keep the dialogue intact, and we'll see what can be done and what cannot be done. So with this now, there is a little change in the agenda, but with this now, I would like to turn to Shri Manav Bansalji for his insight on headwinds on capital infusion in biogas or Bio-CNG industry from investors' perspective. Mr. Bansal has a very diversified and impressive portfolio from finance side. So over to you, sir. We are not able to hear you, sir, somehow. Still not. I think there is some problem with the microphone. Let me just check, sir, just a second. No, still we are not able to hear you. So maybe you try without the microphone because there is some problem. You are unmuted. It should work. Yeah, now it's okay, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Before I start, a quick 30 seconds introduction to myself. I run NEEV Fund, which is a private equity fund with a great amount of focus of investing into renewable and impact sectors. In fact, I see Mr. Gaurav Kapoor, who's sort of been the architect of NEEV Fund and many such funds in India. So my mandate is essentially to provide private equity capital to companies which work in the broader segment of renewable energy. And obviously, biomass or bioenergy is one of the most important sectors that we're looking at. Our first fund is fully deployed, and we have exposure to Bio-CNG through 2 of our investments. And in fact, we've just about closing the next fund, which is double in size of the first fund. And there again, we have a significant commitment to invest in the bioenergy sector. So this sector is extremely important to us. In fact, perhaps a third of our business will be dependent on success of this sector. So with this background, we've learned a bit, both positives and negatives. And we're happy to share these with everybody around and see if we can find some solutions. I will try and speak at 3 levels. One, what are the requirements that a private equity investor such as us we look at a very, very high level? Then what are the issues that we have faced in the recent past, and what could be some of the solutions that we can provide or suggest? just on coming back to Mr. Jagdale's view, some of the elements that you mentioned are extremely important, both decarbonization as well as self-reliance. There is a study or a ballpark number that we work with that if India were to use this entire biomass potential, the import of crude will go down as much as 40%. And as we know, POL is the largest import basket, and if that goes down to 40%, the impact that it has on the country and economy is positive and perhaps unimaginable. So at a very basic level, what does a private equity investor such as us look at? We just essentially want three things. We want that we should be able to identify a risk and we should be able to price a risk. If there is a company or a project or an investment opportunity that comes to us, we should be, to the extent possible, identify what is the risk in that investment and therefore price it. Second thing that we require, and this is particularly the case in India, is a stable regulatory environment. Whatever we signed off on today should continue for the life of the project that we have signed it for. And third is that can we have this business at scale? Will it be experimentation stage, or will the regulators, the enablers, and the private sector do this business at a scale and therefore make money for themselves, make money for us, and in the process benefit the economy with both direct employment as well as all the positive benefits that has been spoken about earlier. So with these three things in mind, when we've looked at what we have had in the recent past, and we've invested in two companies who work in biomass sector. One of them is a company called Prespel. Their principal business is to collect agri residue after the crop has been harvested. The residue which is left is collected and then either burnt as biomass or as briquettes, or then used for conversion into biofuel. And the second company that we have invested in is a company called Blue Planet, and their principal business is integrated solid waste management, including waste to energy. And that gives me a segue of a bit of a quirk that we have in the municipal solid waste sector, wherein what is recognized as a bona fide business is conversion of municipal solid waste to electricity rather than to energy. It was also the case in the agri sector, but I know for sure that IREDA has made a change and MNRE has agreed to make that change. But that is a specific ask that we have, that whenever we are talking about solid waste to electricity, it should always be solid waste to energy, because different forms of energy may be more beneficial both from an investment perspective as well as from the yield perspective, rather than just conversion into electricity. So the risks that we have seen, and Gaurav had recently mentioned about what, or there was another speaker who spoke about 500 odd MOUs, what's been the learning. Some of the key issues that we face is, for example, the price escalation in the Satat scheme is not defined. It is 46 rupees today. What about 4 years from now? Is there a regulator who's going to decide it? Is it the oil marketing companies who decided? What is the cash flow coming from there? If we as an investor have to take a risk into that business, we need to have some certainty of that business. Again, something which was mentioned by Mr. Jagadle was that there is going to be some news coming out about biofertilizer, liquid fertilizer, but as of now, that is also a black box. These are two big hindrances that we see, which makes it difficult for us to either identify or to price the risk. That is on the revenue side. Quickly on the financial side, one of the key elements of our project financing of such schemes is not necessarily the term loans, but the working capital loans. And despite the fact that the private equity fund that we run is a step-down subsidiary of State Bank of India, even we found it extremely challenging to access working capital loans for our investments. in case of agri residue, the working capital cycles are much longer because you have to collect during the harvest season and you have to supply all through the year. And when the off-takers, especially the oil marketing companies or PSUs, they are just unable to make this or have this understanding that for a business to survive, if you were to put all the risk on the supplier, they're going to price it and make the product unviable. For example, HPCL and BPCL have been coming out with tenders for now almost 1.5 years, and it's become a bit of a joke within the investment community for large biorefineries. But every time a tender comes in, they get the bids. The bids are fairly pricey for the raw material, and they are cancelled again and again. And nobody seems to get the simple fact that they are pricey because the tender conditions are such that transfer so much risk on the supplier that the supplier has no option but to price those risks. The third issue that we face typically is sometimes there is a difference of opinion between what the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas is thinking and what the Ministry of Renewable Energy is thinking. MNRE pushes something, but it sometimes gets stuck in the thinking of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, and pricing is obviously still a domain of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, not MNRE. So therefore there is a bit of a regulatory mismatch which needs to be sorted. So these are very high level issues, understanding that we have limited time. Some of the suggestions that we have is that while the scheme is very good, perhaps it does need an expert committee to be put together. Perhaps some of the senior lenders and private equity players could also come together and support MNRE with some suggestions which make these projects investable and bankable. The second point that we had is something that we made earlier. Let the output be flexible. Don't unnecessarily make it in electricity, especially in solid-based to electricity projects. Allow them to be Bio-CNG or whatever. The third is, the gentleman from UN spoke about technology. We also understand that this sector requires a significant injection of proven technology. Once again, it is not there in India. So perhaps, again, a set of experts need to come together and make the technology landscape and acceptance which is flexible enough and defines the standard. One bigger overall suggestion could be that just like we had a solar mission, we had a wind mission, perhaps it's a time to constitute a biomass mission with ambitious goals and enabling mechanisms which can then take biomass to the potential it has. That's all from my side. Happy to take any questions, any suggestions. We remain extremely interested in investing in the sector, and hopefully we will have enough opportunities coming up to make those investments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. That was really good to understand what people think from other side of the table. And it's very important to de-risk the risk and try to analyze from all the perspective, because, if we are ready to invest from our side, then others can also think of investing. So we need to be very honest and we need to be very practical. Then only we can really, define the whole ecosystem in a very healthy manner. Thanks a lot, sir. I think that was quite good from the overall perspective. So with this, I think Mr. Shah is also with us, Mr. Chintan Shah. And I would like to hand it over to Shri Chintan Shah ji now, and who has got the diversified and very unique profile, starting from TERI to Suzlon and now in IREDA. So, sir, it would be quite good if you can just, throw some light on the subject. Hello.
Am I audible?
Yeah, loud and clear, sir.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I was a bit delayed with another meeting which I had, and we just got delayed. As a banker, I would like to say a couple of things over here. Yes, as far as bioenergy is concerned, IREDA has been looking very favorably and positively to fund bioenergy. But bioenergy has got its own challenges. Essentially, I think this entire seminar today is on about in terms of biogas. That means essentially to do with biomethanation. Couple of things that we as a banker, when I'm talking as a banker, I'm talking on behalf of all bankers, including IREDA. Essentially on the CBG front, we know that everybody knows that under the Satat scheme, the government is looking at putting about 5,000 CBG plants in India. And we're talking about close to addressing 50 million tons of biomass to be utilized towards biomethanation and essentially produce methane gas or compressed biogas. Couple of things that comes to our mind is when we look at the project returns and all, most of the project returns are in the range of 16 to 18%, which is definitely a welcome for any banker to look at commercial viability of these projects. However, one thing that we always face as a banker is looking at the offtake arrangement. As we know that the oil marketing companies are supposed to buy the CBG, which I think today the rate is at 4 to 6 rupees a kg. And recently, I think the MOPNG has talked about to continue for buyback at least for 10 years with a reset coming in 2024, which is 46 rupees is a base rate. That's the minimum that you can get, which is a welcome. However, the major issue that comes is take or pay contract. In case of CBG, if you are going to enter with a contract with the oil marketing company, it's not a take or pay contract. That means essentially they will allocate a petrol pump to you or a gas station to you, where essentially you get money once the gas is sold. Now this becomes a little bit tricky for a banker. What happens once when the gas is not sold, and what happens to those revenue? So we are talking also with MOPNG that at least we should have a 50% take or pay contract with the oil marketing company, which will definitely give a comfort to the banker. The second major question that comes is, where do you get your biomass from? Because we have seen that most of the biomass projects has failed in the past because you don't have the right fuel linkages. This is something which is dealing with a very unorganized sector for procurement of the raw material. So we are suggesting people to look at aggregators, biomass aggregators, and enter into a long-term contract with them so that you never have a problem in terms of the raw material that has been utilized for CBG. The other options are simpler, are essentially using a press mud where you can tie up with a sugar mill when you get the press mud residue from which you essentially create biogas. One thing which I think the biogas industry needs to write to the government is, can it be extended credit guarantee cover, which will definitely give a huge amount of comfort for the banker. And because these are small size projects and this has to be spread across the India in the rural area. So some sort of a credit guarantee cover would essentially help most of the generators to get easy finance from the bankers. One thing that comes to my mind is, can we somehow establish linkages with large corporate players who are anyway dealing with farmers today? A couple of main names that come to my mind is John Deere, L&T, ITC, Reliance Fresh, because they are dealing with farmers on a daily basis. Somehow if we can garner their support and make them a part of this entire thing, then I think putting up this 5,000 CBG plants may not be much of a problem, because these are large players, organized players, having linkage with the farmers, and have the financial muscle also to push things. And finally, as I would say that we've been funding projects on CBG front, and we've been insisting most of our generators to also look at, apart from the IOCL contract, look at the private sector contract, where they'll be using this biogas and essentially get your money much in time. Otherwise, we, as I said, as IREDA, we are very open to it. The size is huge, the potential is huge. We're talking about 5,000 CBG plants. We're talking about something like 50,000 crores of project investment that would come up. And if you look at 70-30 debt equity ratio, you're looking at garnering 150,000 crores of debt, by 2023. So it's a sizable market. It's very important that we need to make it scalable. There may be projects which are very good, very viable, but we need to make it scalable. And essentially, more and more important thing that I come to over here is one of the more important portion that comes out as a byproduct is the manure. So it's important to somehow linkage with entities like Tripco, NAFED, so that you can get essentially the manure produce can also be marketed properly, and this will be very high levels of NPK manure. That's all I had to add over here. We are open to financing these projects. As at this juncture, we are in the middle of appraising 2 big projects for CBG, and we'll be open for that. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was quite concrete, and we sincerely hope that the audience is enriched now from the information. For sure, scalability, for sure, if you see the whole value chain, the market introduction of the gas part, which is there now from certain point of view, but also the market introduction of the bioslurry part is equally important, especially when we are talking about the number of such projects to happen. And apart from this, of course, as you rightly mentioned, if we can shake hand with the big players, then the number 5,000 is nothing. Always at association, we say that when Germany can have 9,000 plant, we can have 90,000 plant, in fact. But anyways, we need to go step by step. So thanks again, sir. So definitely there will be a lot of questions for you from the audience side. So we'll just revert after the session. So with this, actually, I would like to come to Mr. Jan. And he can perhaps talk from the rating perspective, what exactly it happens when you really apply to an institution like IREDA. So over to you, Mr. Jan.
Right. So Gaurav, I just wanted to share my screen. So if you can just allow me to do that.
Yes, just a second. I will make you the presenter, and then you can share your screen. Just hold on. Presenter. I think now you should be able to share your screen.
Just give me 1 second. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think thanks, Gaurav. So I think I'll not take too much time. So this is from a credit perspective, how we look at the multiple players that access credit rating agencies for grading their projects. So just a brief about our organization. We are a global rating agency. We are a part of a multinational which is called Fitch Ratings, and it's based out of New York, and we have a global presence. And we are among the top 3 rating agencies in the country. And as I said, we are a 100% subsidiary of the Fitch Group. And we have offices across India. And these are some of the marquee names that we cover and interact with on a regular basis. Now, just coming on to how we look at the framework. So this entire framework, if you look at, for assessing any Bio-CNG project that comes to a rating agency for assessment, is primarily premised on 3 pillars. So these are the 3 pillars of a credit rating. The first is the business risk profile. The second is the financial risk profile. And the third is what we call as the management assessment. Now, I will go through each of these pillars, individually. So just, in terms of what are the drivers, what a rating agency looks at when they analyze each of these pillars. So if you look at the first pillar, which is the business risk. So this is broken down into multiple subsectors. And one of the important pillars that we look at is the operating risk. So normally when every project approaches us, we would have looked at, let's say, certain number of projects. Now, there are differences between what each project indicates its level of optimal production. So, obviously that has an impact on how the overall cash flows look like when you have different levels of CNG production and fertilizer production. The other bigger challenge for us as a rating agency is, since we are talking about integration of Bio-CNG directly with the pipeline, or let's say even the MDP pipelines that we have in the CGD network, the quality and the safety of those network, is something that, has to be ensured by either the network operator or the, operators themselves. And if you look at the feedstock arrangement, which I think some of the participants also touched upon, is the nature of the feedstock, because there are multiple feedstocks that you can have. And within that nature of feedstock, what kind of contracts do you have? Whether they are spot contracts or they are long-term contracts, because long-term contracts allows us to have a visibility in terms of the raw material availability. So as we call the term as availability risk, so that reduces if you have a long-term contract. And also that risk reduces, with the counterparty that you have. So if it is a very strong counterparty, then, it's definitely good. Now, if you look at, the difference, which some people talked about, that the operating cycle, if you tie up for press mud, the sugar plant, 180 days is the normal operating cycle of a sugar plant, while for a Bio-CNG, it's about 330 to 365 days. So that is, one big difference that comes in, that you have to have adequate storage facility. And in some cases, the backup is, just not, available. And, the quantum of backup has to be substantial, so that in case there is any disruption of supply from the primary source, there is adequate availability of raw material. And the third one is obviously the pricing under the contract and the quality of, raw material, because, if it, is left open or it deteriorates, that is, that ultimately affects the yield that you finally have. And one important thing that we see happening in some of the other plants, other sectors, is the competing plants in the vicinity. So ultimately, that might result in some kind of a competition for the raw material itself. So that is an important factor that we look at, how many competing plants are there in the vicinity. Now, if you look at, this is the second risk that we cover in the business risk profile, which is largely the offtake risk. So if you look at any particular plant, there are two revenue streams that we typically talk about. So one is the Bio-CNG and the second is the fertilizer stream. Now, on the Bio-CNG side, it roughly contributes about 60 to 65% of the total revenue, depending upon the assumptions. And fertilizer side of the business contributes about 30 to 35% of the total revenue. Now, we see certain amount of risks in both these, revenue streams. So I think the larger risk for us is obviously the duration of the contract, given that the contract duration is only 7 to 8 years, as outlined in the policy. While if you look at the plant life, that's nearly as high as 15 to 25 years. So there's a clear mismatch between the plant life and the duration of the contract. And the second risk, which I think was mentioned, was the take or pay. So we call it as, the minimum guarantee. So I think that should be present both ways. So even if the supply is, lesser than the, the average contracted quantity, there should be a penalty. And if the offtake is less than the guaranteed, then there also should be a penalty that should kick in. So today the contracts are open-ended, so which leave a lot of variability in what ultimately is the offtake. So an entrepreneur can have adequate production, but whether that offtake is essentially, being done, is a challenge, and hence we sensitize those assumptions, which ultimately impact the cash flows. The second risk that we see is a larger risk for us on the fertilizer side. So one is the price of the fertilizer is still not, decided. We talk about urea. In some of the models that have come to us, we have seen fertilizer prices as high as 6 to 7 rupees. While normally, if you look at the benchmark prices, they are significantly lower, than the prices quoted. So as such, there is no price, which is decided. Maybe, a similar price structure can also be worked out what we have in Bio-CNG, where a minimum kind of a price is, definitely on the cards. Then the second bigger problem that we see is the offtake risk. So today, if you look at the fertilizer sector, it's taken its own time to have an established process in terms of offtake. So today, if you have to educate the farmer, that becomes a big, challenge, and that effort has to be taken in order to ensure an adequate amount of offtake. And the third thing that we see is the proportion of the bulk sales versus the retail sales, as some players have suggested they're trying to create a retail brand. But obviously those sales quantum are very, low. And here also a bigger risk is the minimum offtake, that there is no minimum offtake guarantee. Now, if you look at the O&M risk, these are pretty standard risks, but 2-3 risks that clearly stand out for us is, the ramp up that is assumed, given the raw material availability, and the distance of the Bio-CNG plant from the OMC retail outlet, because that ultimately impacts your transportation cost to a very large extent. Because the 46 rupees is a delivered price at the OMC retail outlet, and if it is greater than 25 kilometers, obviously the cost has to be borne by the Bio-CNG players themselves. And one challenge, which is a practical challenge, I don't know if, whether all of you would be facing this problem, is the fact that today, if a CNG station is already selling the normal CNG, which is priced much lower, for him to actually have an incentive to integrate Bio-CNG, which is at a significantly higher price, could ultimately become a challenge. And obviously the taxation part, which is GST versus the VAT and excise, that still is our answer. And this is one thing I think which was talked about also. So whenever we look at any regulatory framework, we divide it into three parts, which is the supportive framework, whether the regulatory framework is just a status quo, nothing changes, or it's a regressive framework. So purely from how we look at these guidelines, they definitely seem very stable and supportive. And from the pricing that has been outlined. One challenge that we have seen, being faced by the players is respect to the subsidy dispersal timelines, because that ultimately impacts the cash flows we are looking at. And the second part is, which I'll cover in the subsequent slide also, is the capital versus the generation, based subsidies, and what happens to the Bio-CNG rates post the expiry of the last period, which is FY29. So that is, though obviously there's a window available, but still, from a policy perspective, it has to be clear where we are headed. If it is coming down, then obviously there's a problem. But if it stays at the same level, so, things could still be managed. Now, this is on the execution risk, basically the funding tie-up, the equity source. And the biggest challenge that we see in case there are time and cost overrun for whatever reason, monsoons or lack of labor availability, as we hear from most of the corporates and during this COVID period. So if there is a cost and time overrun, then how do things, look like? Now, this is, I would request you all to focus on this slide a bit more, given that this is something to do with the financial aspects, which, probably slightly technical, but I'll take 2-3 minutes to just cover this in a nutshell and tell you what the essence of this slide is. So this is, if you look at, is the second pillar that any rating agency would look at, and we also give a fair amount of weightage to this particular pillar of the credit rating. Now, a project by its very fundamental nature has to have certain cash flows which should be sufficient for the interest and principal repayments to happen. Now, if you take a loan, there's an interest component and there's a principal component. Now, the cash flows that the project generates should be sufficient to meet both these elements. We see that happening in certain years, but the moment we stress the assumptions basis the slides that I showed you earlier, whether it is on the fertilizer sale or on the price of the fertilizer or on the output of Bio-CNG, the debt service ratio, which is the DSCR, actually changes significantly. And the other bigger problem we see is the working capital lack of availability, given that most of the bankers would not be comfortable funding the inventory part. They will be comfortable funding, let's say, the debtors part, but not the inventory, which is either work in progress or on the raw material side. Finished good inventory could still be funded to a certain extent. Then these are some of the other ratios that any rating agency would look at. Now, coming on to the second thing which we have is the liquidity assessment. Now, this basically tells you, and this is unique to what we do, in terms of we stress test our assumptions, in every scenario possible, and see what are the cushions that you as a project developer have kept in the project. Now, these could be buffers during an under construction phase. It could be buffers relating to capital cost increase. Let's say you envisage the project at 34-35 crores, but ultimately it ends up at 36-37 crores. So what are the kind of buffers that you have maintained within the system? What are the working capital lines available? And if not, then what is the cash cushion that you as a promoter are willing to put in the business? Then obviously the cash flow from operations, and what is the actual liquidity available in your own balance sheet? And last but not the least, how committed are you to the project in terms of the infusions that you would have made during the project? Now, the other point is in terms of the financing agreements that you have, let's say somebody like an IREDA or with the banking system, which is to do with how you look at the repayment profile, how you look at the moratorium period, and what is the debt service reserve account. So this is, you can say, like a cookie, cookie jar wherein you keep funds for the bad period, or the bankers would want to keep funds for the bad period. And the last but not the least is the important piece, so which is, as I've been saying, we do stress tests, so which I'll cover in the subsequent slide, is the sensitivity of certain parameters on the overall project viability. Now, you will be surprised to know, this is just the ballpark assessment that we do. I've shown as a case study, but what is more relevant is the next slide. So if you look at what actually moves the DSCR, so which is the debt service coverage ratio, for a lot of these projects that we would have seen, in our journey, are these 5 parameters specifically for a Bio-CNG, plant, which is the yield of Bio-CNG, the yield of the fertilizer, the price of the fertilizer, the feedstock price, and the rate of interest. Now, any particular model that we as an agency would have received, every model is sensitive to either of these particular assumptions. And given what I highlighted in the business risk profile, there is a certain risk associated with each of these elements, which gets priced, or which gets captured in the way the final ratings are arrived at. Now, if you look at this is, ballpark what we call as a typical sensitivity, analysis. It looks like a thermometer or a heat map. But the idea is a number above 1 is what is required. DSCR, as I said, is basically the total operating profits divided by whatever are your repayments. Now, in view of that, anything less than 1 is an area of problem. And that is wherever you see red, that's a sign of problem. So you can clearly see the 5 variables that I mentioned: the yield of Bio-CNG, the yield of solid fertilizer, the liquid slurry, the price of press mud, which is the raw material, have an actual bearing on how the DSCRs for a particular project move. And hence we need to be very cognizant of, these variables. And that is where we stress these assumptions that are being provided to us by the project developer. Now, this is again on the interest rate, again, of those 5, how does the overall picture look like if you stress, those assumptions. But the broad point to take home is these are, the assumptions which are not hard. So there is a variability which is, I would say, very large, because in certain projects that we received, the Bio-CNG yield was 5.5%, while in certain other projects, I don't know whether it was a mistake or something else, the yield actually happened to be about 8 to 9%. So it cannot be possible that the same input can have varying levels of outputs. So I think there is a lack of standardization, at least in the models that we receive, and hence once we try to standardize the models, the DSCR covers fall comparatively to a larger extent. Now, this is the third pillar, which I said, probably for banks and for us, this also is a very key pillar in terms of who is the promoter who is actually setting up this plant. And as somebody mentioned, if a larger corporate, actually has, let's say, some kind of a joint venture or some kind of a stake, that obviously helps support the project during, stress periods. So we look at the promoter experience and the track record of the promoters and his ability or the demonstrated track record that he has in carrying out similar projects. If he has, well and good. If he has not, then what is the experience that he's bringing onto the table? And if there is any strong parent, let's say, if you are a part of a large MNC or a large corporate, obviously those linkages between the parent and you help in the arrival of the final rating. And as I said, equity is an important feature because the sector, obviously requires both working capital and debt for capex. So I think these two things are important, and hence the ability of the promoter to bring in money at the required time is something of essence. So, we also look at the net worth statement of the promoters and what are the sources of equity that the promoter, basically outlines to us. Now, this is what, in a nutshell, I would say are the constraining factors to any credit rating of the Bio-CNG plants. What I've done is I've divided these issues in something that we look at an issuer specific and something which is to do with the regulations per se. Now, if you look at the issuer specific constraints, so they are largely the capability of the promoters to bring in equity. Everybody says they have adequate amount they will bring in. But normally we don't see those net worth statements supporting the equity infusion that is required. The other challenge we see is most of these guys rely on local civil contractors, which is a part of where they are in the ecosystem. But obviously a better civil contractor helps the overall structure, because as a rating agency you get that confidence. Now, one important thing I would like to highlight, we've seen some promoters, maybe not too many, but some of them form their own LLCs and then get the TEV reports prepared by those LLCs only. So a submission to all of you would be it's always better to spend quality money upfront rather than looking at just side pocketing some change. So it's better to have a reputed TEV consultant in some of these projects, which helps a rating agency also assess the nuances of the project in a much better fashion. And the other points are the feedstock cost and the availability. And as I said, we have got very aggressive assumptions both on the fertilizer sale price and the liquid fertilizer sale price. So that needs to be toned down. So these are very issuer specifics. And as I said, promoter experience and background is something that is obviously kept in mind. Now, these are policy level issues which we believe constrain the credit rating at times. As I said, the Bio-CNG contract and the fertilizer contracts lack a minimum offtake guarantee. So they specify a price, especially the Bio-CNG one. But in the fertilizer one, there is no price also which is specified, which leaves a lot of subjectivity in what the entrepreneur feels is the right price for his produce. And as I said, sales of solid and liquid fertilizers is not an easy job, given that you're competing with the likes of urea, though this has better NPK content, but still from a farmer perspective, something that is sold at 5 rupees per kg. And if you assume that this will be sold at 7 to 8 rupees, that's slightly far-fetched. So educating the farmers and the market development for both solid and liquid fertilizers is something that somebody has to take an onus, on. And one common argument that we keep hearing is, इस सेल का प्राइस जीरो मान लीजिए और इस सेल का आउटपुट आप मान लीजिए कि हम नहीं बेच रहे हैं. But that does not work, because the moment you go on to that assumption, the plant actually has to stop operations, because you cannot keep piling on the liquid and the solid fertilizers in your plant. So, any entrepreneur who believes that a rating agency will, probably, if you assume this sale price to be zero, you are not solving the problem. It's actually a bigger problem that we then enter into, because ultimately we are saying at some point the plant needs to close down purely because it has no place to store the liquid and the solid fertilizers. And other thing is, these plants cannot be set up everywhere, because we are talking about injection either into the grid, or we are talking about the delivery to the nearest petrol pump. So obviously a network has to be there for both the vehicular traffic as well as the readiness of that particular pump to sell what is being delivered. So obviously you cannot have a large inventory piling up at the facility, which is the delivery point. And as I said, the CNG network is still growing. It is not that we are saturated in the CNG network. Till the 7th round of the CGD bidding, we were actually quite low. It's only the 9th and the 10th round which has probably opened up the overall economy to CNG as a fuel. And as I highlighted earlier, the dual price, which is applicable for a CGD entity on what he sells on his own, and what is the Bio-CNG price as 46 versus something, let's say 35, 36 is the price at which a CGD entity, the base price excluding the taxes. So the incentive to integrate probably seems low. And there's the light slab from my side is on, the way forward. So I think one big ask that we have is, if you look at some of the other industries that have developed, they have established clear benchmark parameters for everything. Whether you look at wind, whether you look at solar, there's a benchmark data available in terms of what are the PLF numbers for solar, what are the PLF numbers for wind, what are the benchmarks available. Here we believe, as we look at more models, the benchmark keep varying. And, for us as a rating agency, that becomes, so we, going by the principle of conservatism, obviously take the lowest one. So, which could obviously impact the project economy. So establishing benchmark parameters on yields, is something which is very, critical. And as an agency, we have always felt, that capex-based incentives, invite a very different kind or set of entrepreneurs than a generation-based incentive. Because in a GBI, you are married to the asset, while in a capex subsidy, you're not marrying the asset. You're looking for that capex subsidy to come upfront. But GBI incentives, you have a long period over which you need to realize, and hence the incentive to operate is far higher than the incentive to just set up that facility. Other thing which we hear in some of the other sectors is interest subvention, but that's a point of a larger debate whether that can be done or no. And as I said, there is no minimum guarantee, and fertilizer sales is about 35 to 40% of the overall revenue. So we require some kind of an assurance that the fertilizer sales is actually there, and there is revenue to be made from that stream. And if you look at some of the, again, we are drawing parallels from how we see the development in some of the other sectors. There has to be a demonstration by some of the larger companies which establishes at least the operating norms and a proper proof of concept for these particular facilities. So one argument that we hear is it's a globally renowned practice, which we take fair argument. But everything which is from a global perspective, marrying it to India has its own set of challenges. Maybe the supply chain is a problem. How some of those successful supply chains have happened, if something can be demonstrated to the entrepreneurs to these particular demonstration plants, and that gives a confidence to the rating agencies also that yes, it's an established concept. All the entrepreneur needs to do is get that structure right. So today we grapple with whether that structure itself is possible. So I think if we have that proof of concept, that is something that can be limited. If you look at the last point, the working capital, if we assume is not likely to come, through whichever means, that the only support that can come in through is the timely payments which have to happen from Bio-CNG. As I understand, the payment cycle is within 15 to 30 days for a Bio-CNG plant, but those payments have to be on dot, because these are small entrepreneurs, and obviously any payment stuck against lack of clarity of bill or volumes could result in problems for even a viable plant. So I think payments from both the fertilizer sale and the Bio-CNG side have to be pretty much on dot if you want the sector to grow and survive. And this is finally what we offer as a credit rating agency. So this is what we call as the rating scale. So this is, you can say, it's a scale of 1 to 10. So first I'll talk about the IRDA grading scale, which is on a grade 1 to grade 8. So you have markings, basis the 3 pillars which we discussed, which is, the business risk profile, the financial and the management quality. You have multiple gradings, and basis that, we assign a grade. The higher the grade, the lower is the interest rate for you. So if you look at the arrows which are there in front of the screen, so higher you go on the grading, the lower is the interest rate. So grade 1 will have a far lower interest rate as compared to a grade 8. And similar is the case for bank loan rating. The higher up we go in the rating ladder. So if you look at the AAA, which is the top end, will have very low interest rates, while somebody at a B category, the third last row from the bottom, will have interest rates of 14 to 15%, while somebody at a AAA will have rates varying from 6.5 to 8% ballpark. So higher you go up in the scale, the lower is the interest cost for you, which is a benefit in the long run, because you pay out lower quantum of your cash flows on account of the interest. So that in a nutshell is what we had from India Ratings for you. Thank you very much for listening to me very patiently. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Jan. It was quite wonderful, in fact, to really go step by step and try to understand the intricacies and try to understand what can be done and what cannot be done. And in case we want to make that happen, we need to do a little more homework. And definitely the benchmarking is something I guess I cannot agree more than what you said. It's very important, because ultimately from an investor point of view, they would like to see the success story. They would like to see the benchmarking, and thereafter only they can talk about the scale of financing. So definitely, I mean, from association side, we are very much working, towards this, and hopefully we'll be able to answer very concretely all your questions on this open loops. We would like to close it, but thanks again, and we'll talk again in the question answer round, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions from the audience side. Yeah. So with this, I think we are doing very good from the time point of view, and I would like to move to Mr. Kapoor. Yeah, and we would like to hear more from the DFID side. How exactly, and how exactly, DFID thinks and what can be done in this renewable sector, or Bio-CNG to be exact, over here. And Mr. Kapoor is the head of inclusive growth and investment from DFID side. He has more than 20 years of work experience across private equity and venture capital investment funds, responsible PE or VC investment, inclusive corporate development and policy reform, having lived and worked in India and in global markets. Over to you, Mr. Kapoor.
Great, thank you. So firstly, thank you to the Indian Biogas Association and to MNRE for inviting me into this. It is so wonderful to actually do this over, from home and to be able to sort of contribute to the conversation. It's been a very rich discussion with all the other panelists who've said, all the things perhaps. So I have an easier job, which is in terms of largely summarizing what they have said. What I will do is, one of the aspects that was asked of me, or what I can bring is about, what are the key to bring in foreign funds and foreign money into the sector in particular? So what I can do is threefold. One, I'll talk about how attractive is the industry to foreign investors, and then what specifically are the elements that add to the attractiveness in that sense. Second, I could just talk about, what are international governments and people like us who support the sector, what can we do and what can DFID do and where are our available funds? And the third thing that I can do is, there is so much to do because it's a sunrise new sector. And so how can we all join up to sort of make things more coherent and really make a difference and impact in the sector? So with those three sort of broad areas, I'll go to the first one. So a short answer to how attractive it is to foreign investors. I think there are different pockets or different parts of the industry, and some of them are more organized and they're more ready and willing and able to attract foreign investments into it. And we've had recent examples of how foreign investment has come into those sectors in that sense. And then there are other parts of it where, the policy, the regulatory part, things are emerging. So, but it's improving. It's on a really important trajectory where it is increasing in attractiveness in that sense. So what are the real key elements, that foreign investors would look at? And I think like some of the panelists have said in the past, it's largely, 4 or 5 things. First, it is about how stable and supportive is the long-term regulatory framework in the country. So people look at it in terms of consistency of the policy. They look at it in terms of the financial incentives that are being provided, and there are different ways of looking at it, and they look at precedents as well. So, for example, if you look at what has been successful that the biogas and Bio-CNG energy industry can look for, there was a solar mission, for example, and that really galvanized the whole sector. It galvanized the world. It got India and the international investors looking to it. So if there was something like that in terms of a bioenergy mission, or something where the government was able to put it all together, that could be something quite fascinating and interesting as a signal to long-term investors to come and invest. The second thing is, I really appreciated the 9 elements that Mr. Dinesh Jagadles talked about, and all the 9 elements are really important. And what they also mean to a foreign investor is that there are different touch points with almost 8 or 9 different ministries in that sense. So how is the coordination of all of that coming together to be able to give comfort to a foreign investor in that sense? So the second part of it, of course, is technology in that sense, and how open doors are our policymakers and the ecosystem to new technologies. Because, for example, from the UK's perspective, there are a lot of technologies which are there in the UK, and will they and the people who are comfortable, and investors who are comfortable with modeling, and we had a really nice presentation from India Ratings talking about all the details level of risk modeling and technology and efficiencies and all of that. So the margins that investors work with are quite thin. So how open doors are the policy to different technologies, and what kind of requirement or incentives are there for capex, as well as the modalities on OPEX financing. The third important part is in terms of supply chain linkages and value chain linkages, and really trying to understand how robust and how well linked and how fragmented or organized those linkages are. And we've also had experience from our own investments to say that an often held view by investors is that the reliability is a big question mark. So what can we do together as an industry to be able to make it more reliable, to suppliers, to off-takers, in a way that can actually work? And if it's needed, other countries have trialed risk-sharing models as well, and other industries within India have done those risk-sharing models with a lot of success. So can this industry try and come up with some models of risk-sharing, which would work depending on the unique context and the subcategories of bioenergy here, in that sense? I think one of the other important things that foreign investors look for is, how well are local domestic investors participating in the sector? So when I talk about domestic investors, it is also about, of course, it is about IREDA, it is about SBI, SIDBI, NABARD, it is about all the other sort of people who are trying to give credit to this, long-term credit, working capital credit, who's putting in money, are promoters putting in money or not? And what are the local investors? Are they do they just think that this is a great, attractive industry, or are they putting their money behind it? And, once they put their money behind it, what kind of issues have they seen? Have they seen good returns? Are they able to take the money back in that sense and show profits to their shareholders or not? I think that's, again, a big question. And I think fifth is, again, the consciousness of sustainability. And there is an increasing view in international investors about green energy, clean energy, where people are willing to take muted returns in that sense, but they do want to make sure that the business is viable, because you do want it to sustain, and sustainability, viability, responsible investments, and all of that elements are very key. Now, if some of these elements can be put in place, and to a large extent, I think in the industry, they are talks about putting them in place as well, which is absolutely great, then, there is tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds available to be able to attract into the country and into these firms and sectors. So, it comes in various forms. So what are the different kinds of investors who are willing to put in money? So from a global perspective, the people who tend to go in first are the development finance institutions. So the development finance institutions are are those who have a development mindset and who are able to put in their investments, often in partnership with the government of India and its nodal agencies, because they want and they can get that assurance of the 5 elements that I talked about in partnership with government. So they are able to bring in a lot of money. Donor agencies like the World Bank, ADB, others are able to bring in the money because of that comfort with government. And then there are other, first-moving private equity fund managers, private equity investors, venture debt funds who are willing to provide that sort of working capital when the other commercial investors are not doing it. And we have Mr. Bansal from SBI, who is one of those sort of pioneering investors who's taken a bet on some of those companies here. Then, of course, there are grant agencies as well, because, this is, like we said, a sector where technology, commercialization of technology research is equally important and needs to go in parallel. So, technical assistance research funds, we have Newton Fund and other areas of technical assistance which are available. And then, of course, there are other, companies who have a more direct line of business in oil and gas or in energy in that sense, and they're willing to come in to India. So there is a whole different set of categories of people who are willing to come in, provided, some of these characteristics of the sector are there. I'll now move over to the second part of what I wanted to talk about, which was, what does DFID do and what sort of available corpus of funds do we have and how can one tap into those? So to be able to just take a step back, I want to say that, DFID is part of the British government. The UK has been one of the first major economies to legislate a commitment to net zero by 2050. And in terms of bioenergy for the UK, it is about 11.3% of the power generation there as of 2019, and about 16.5% to 17% of the capacity that we have. So I think it's really an important and increasingly important component even in the UK as it is in India. And from there is a COP26 coming up. So from a climate leadership perspective as well, where the UK has the chair, it is very important, and it's a big opportunity for us to work together with India in any way possible to try and see how we can strengthen that. In terms of funds specifically, we have our own funds in India, and we have helped set up some funds like the NEEF fund, where you had Mr. Bansal who gave a bit of a talk about it. And then there are 100% green growth sector funds that we've set up along with the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, which we partnered and we put in 120 million of our funds, pounds, and 120 million of Government of India through NIIF. And we have a big fund which is looking at setting up different platforms, and they do have platforms on waste energy, and they do have platforms which work with bioenergy in a very direct way. So I think that's something where we are very much looking forward to working with India and through our investment pods. And we also have an arm called the CDC Group, which has about 1.2 billion pounds of investments in India. And I'm aware that they're also looking at bioenergy for investments in a big way, and they sort of try and put in ticket sizes above 10 million into those assets, as does the Green Growth Equity Fund with the NIIF that I talked about. And then we have, like I said, research partnerships, technical assistance, where we work on capacity. So this is where now I will now switch to the third part, which is basically about, how can we all join up and do things better to really make a difference? So I've talked about, using technical assistance in terms of policy, trying to work across different government stakeholders. I really like the idea of Dr. Mishra, who said, let's also understand from our failures. If we have issued some LOIs and they've not worked, what is it that we can do proactively to correct it? And investors really like honesty. So I think that's something that we could do. There is capacity building. There is also financing. Maybe if agencies like IREDA want to tap into global markets where, credit, the percentage and their, the interest rates are low, then London Stock Exchange is a great example because it's already sort of helped more than 100 green bonds, for example. So, we could find different ways of working with them. And then as different, we've also worked with farmer producer organizations, with village level entrepreneurs to try and make sure that we are unlocking microfinance and other kind of finance that they could use, where, we come in at the top level, but then there are our partners in India who then deploy and go down to the last mile and are able to bring in the rural connectivity. So, together with this and the fact that we've heard from our investees that 70% of the top line revenue that some of these companies generate go back to the farmers. So it is really part of a circular economy from a financing perspective as well. And how can we try and look at the opportunity of this migration and start to create that rural economy where many of these supply chains can be strengthened and we can all collectively do better. So I think those were the 3 points largely that I wanted to touch on. And I also want to say again that this is a sector that we are very willing to support and support more going forward. And we're very happy that and grateful that the association has taken the step to really galvanize some thinking so that maybe together we can take some collective actions as next steps in that sense. So with that, I will probably stop now. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Kapoor. That was quite, in fact, quite a nice one. I personally learned a lot from this presentation as well. And definitely, structuring is one of the very crucial thing in any sector. And to be honest, and try to learn from the failure and try to ensure that this kind of failure doesn't happen in future, and to really ensure the same thing in the model itself is something that which can really, lay down the foundation of the success, especially when we are talking about the Bio-CNG. And it is also very overwhelming that we have got a very active audience over here. We are flooded with a lot of questions. And several hundreds actually joined through YouTube, Facebook as well. So what we have done, we have compiled few questions only because we are, tight on time. But nevertheless, we'll just throw some question, and it would be quite good if you can just, comment on it. So maybe I start with the first question to Mr. Shah, and the audience has asked that. It's quite interesting that do the priority sector lending norms actually in real sense have an influence on the lending institutions, that is banks, to take exposure in a priority sector, particularly biogas or Bio-CNG under the renewables?
Yeah. Normally what happens, every bank has a specific quota to fund projects in the priority sector. So a lot of banks would like to lure investments into such projects. And this is something which is not documented, but normally, as you would see, for priority sector, it should have a difference of about 200 to 50 basis points of interest reduction that the bank may offer. The reason being that if they are not able to deploy those funds in a priority sector, the same amount of fund needs to be parked with either NABARD or SIDBI by every bank. So logically then, because entire financing of NABARD and SIDBI is towards priority sector. So the bank has an option to do it directly. If they can't do it, the money goes to NABARD and SIDBI at a much lower rate. So now most of these banks would try to give something like 150 to 200 basis points of reduction in the cost of interest. I think that addresses the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So with this, I will come to the next question. And it says, one of the requirements to fund a project that was mentioned by Mr. Bansal was possibility to identify risk. I mean, it was mentioned that few risks are in terms of larger working capital cycle for biomass aggregators, risk of price escalation in offtake contracts of OMCs, oil marketing companies, and so on. Further, Mr. Jan talked about 3 pillars of rating. Now, the question which has come up is, if weights are given or are to be put across all identified risks, what would possibly feature as higher weighted risk and the possible mitigation measures that you see for the same? Mr. Bansal, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very thought-provoking question. And it's actually not an easy answer as to which risk would have the highest weighted. Without trying to make it confusing, I think the certainty of price will perhaps be the most important element. Because if you have a revenue line certainty, you would be able to sort out the working capital, you will be able to sort out the term loan. So I would put that as the number one risk.
Okay. And the audience also directed this question to Mr. Jan. Mr. Jan, any comment from your side on this?
Yeah, so I think am I audible, Gaurav?
Yeah, loud and clear, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of the pillars, I think there is no clear demarcation that I would say we have in terms of weightages being assigned. So if I were to put it, it's not a mathematical model that we are working for assigning a rating. It's if you were to put these three, so I think there are risk categorizations as I showed you, different level of scales. So every company that we rate would fall in different parameters in different risk categories. So ultimately, the final rating that you have in front of you is a culmination of those different risks. And we typically go by the theory of the least. So if there is a constraining factor, let's say if the management quality is quite weak, so that will what we will call as the constraining factor to the ratings. While in some cases, as I highlighted, if the business risk profile is very weak, then that could become the constraining factor. So whatever is the weakest link in the chain, that in a way becomes the overall cap on that particular rating. So that is how we look at the rating universe.
Understandable, and it makes sense even to actually de-risk the risk from your side. So definitely. So with this, I go further, and one of the participants has asked that a persisting reluctance seen amongst the lending institutions to being exposed to biogas or Bio-CNG sector, despite the assured long-term offtake agreements under the Satat scheme, because now they talk till 10 years, it does not seem to convince the lenders and the investors to the desired extent. There are only a handful projects on ground after the Satat scheme was launched almost 2 years back. So financial closures seem to be the major hurdle for lenders are extremely risk averse and unwilling to take exposure in this industry. You already mentioned that about mitigating the risk to an extent, which create guarantee cover scheme. But the question that is still crops up is what other possible fundamental structural change in the financial machinery could possibly rake up the confidence in the lenders? This sounds quite important. So this question is directed to Mr. Bansal again and to Mr. Kapoor. So Mr. Bansal, any comment on it?
Yeah, I think principally, whenever we talk about investments in infrastructure, you would find that eventually the solutions lie in the regulatory framework, not in the financial framework. Because financial framework, so to say, responds to the regulatory framework. By that, what I mean is that if the regulatory framework is risk-free, the financial framework will also consider it to be risk-free and priced accordingly. And how does it translate into, for example, Satat scheme? If, for example, by putting up a project, you're not certain on your own cash flows. If it is the oil marketing companies will pay you when they generate revenue, then you are not taking the risk on the project you are funding, but then you are taking a risk on ability of oil marketing company to actually sell it. And if they're not able to sell it, and what was also raised is from the same CNG station, you have two different kinds of gas, etc., etc. Because the regulatory framework is not making the revenue line as certain or as firm, the financial framework will, in responding to that, is unable to take that risk. As NEEV fund, I represent the risk capital. I'm not a senior lender. So we have Irida who will give a perspective from a senior lender's perspective. But even as an equity capital, as a risk capital, I am not able to see my returns clearly. Then it becomes fairly difficult for us to take a view. So sorry, just to not give a long answer. Effectively, it's a regulatory framework that we need to settle, not the financial framework. Over to you, Mr. Kapoor.
Hi. So yes, I think I agree with Mr. Bansal in terms of the answer. So in many of these cases, I think one has to really unpack the risk in several layers, and then try and really understand what point is that sort of a pain point, and who can address that the best. So, it is part of a regulatory process as well. And if there is also a financial product, for example, customized financial solutions could come in to really give people the comfort to be able to sort of manage that risk. We've seen that kind of structure also happen in some countries and geographies as well. So I think that's basically what I wanted. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jagdaliji, maybe you can intervene here because there are a few questions, and if I just compile, these are mainly for the regulatory purpose only. So basically, they are also talking if there is a bulk waste generator, maybe it's from the sugar factory, let's say it's press mud, or maybe it's a food process industry, or maybe even the distillery, if they can arrange spent wash, etc. Does it create extra impact for you, or for you from MNRE perspective, it remains the same? You don't see any difference in that?
Gaurav, I think the feedstock availability is definitely a good point to be considered in terms of multi-feedstock. And if there are aggregators who are bulking the feedstock, who are managing the feedstock and providing it to the developer, if I understand the question correctly, it would be a welcome move, whether it's in any sector, whether it's biomass to power or biomass to gas. And I always believe that one has to primarily look at multi-feedstock options, and that's how, whether it's the sugar press mud or the distillery waste, or whether the biomass waste, so mixing it out and making it available throughout the year so that your output, assured output, is being managed would be a welcome move. So all that they consider is their option of raw material or feedstock should be well defined in their detailed project report, so that we are aware at the beginning itself that there is this is the material and this is how the risk mitigation in terms of the input risk is mitigated. So I would definitely prefer that.
Okay, that sounds interesting. In fact, now I come to the next question, and this is with respect to the carbon credit market. So it says we all are aware of carbon credit in the form of CR, that is certified emission ratings, being a potent source of improving the economic viability of a clean energy project. But the way demand for the carbon credit has shrunk since the initial few years of popularity under the CDM, that is Clean Development Mechanism, it matters a lot, and it is a matter of concern. So maybe, I mean, he's asking that maybe our esteemed panelists can throw some light, especially Mr. Kapoor. Can you, put some light on it? And then the question is also directed to Mr. Mishra. So, Mr. Kapoor.
Yes, so I think that's a very good question again, and there was a lot of buoyancy in the market in the past, and I think what we need to do is make sure that the pricing and the principles are adhered to by all the stakeholders. So largely, I think the philosophy of this was in terms of polluter pays, and essentially, I think even from this industry's perspective, that's what we should also try and see, how can we follow that same principle in that sense. And of course, with the CDM and others, it's a very internationally, benchmark mechanism in which some of this financing can also flow back and forth, because there are some industries which necessarily have to incur some sort of quote unquote pollution or polluting aspects, and there are others like this industry which can come in and sort of benefit from some of these kind of international mechanisms, which are trying to actually bring more parity and justice between industries and sectors in that sense. So it is a very good question, and I think we'll need to sort of look at it and investigate how is it that we can make it flow down to the benefit. Because when you have village level entrepreneurs and smaller companies, their ability to try and even understand these kind of optionalities for bringing in monetary benefits is quite limited. So I think we'll need to sort of figure it out and make sure that we're able to try and open it up and join the dots where we need to. So again, it's an excellent question, and I think we could do more in terms of doing the join up for the sector. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Vishnu,
Gaurav, nothing to add from my side. I think Mr. Kapoor has given the answer.
Okay. I come to the next question. We still have 3-4 minutes actually. So the next question is directed to Mr. Jagdale, and it says that sir, normally any bulk waste generator, organic bulk waste generator, they should actually treat their waste by default. They should. But what the question says that is it possible to make it mandatory for them to treat their bulk waste, this organic waste through biomethanation routes?
Okay, I think it's a good suggestion to be looked at. That's how the market demand will be created. So we will look into that aspect so that there is some compulsory obligation on those waste generators to be treated under the biomethane route. We will discuss within ourselves, but good point to be noted. I note it down. Thank you.
So one more question, in fact, I will go to you, sir, and then perhaps we can close this question answer round. And the question is that normally, we always talk from the project promoter point of view. We always talk from the project point of view. But what about the startups, the new companies, or other companies who are venturing into this sector, in Bio-CNG sector? So what kind of support they can expect, especially when there are EPC companies, there might be BOT companies. That's what the question says. Yeah. So can they expect extra support? The support for the EPC companies?
I'm not able to hear you. There is some disturbance. Gaurav, can you come back again, please?
Okay, I just put it in my words, a simple word. So the question is, sir, that normally the EPC companies who will be doing the projects, Bio-CNG projects, can they also get some incentive so that they can really do it in a cost-effective manner? That's the question.
This is a business model mechanism to be evolved. Actually, the incentives for the EPC, it has to come through their inherent technological solutions and the way they look at it. I don't think some sort of at every stage we will be able to provide that. So it is the EPC companies that they have to really look at how best they are incentivized within the system with the developer to get it first time right and at the quality they are strict to. So it's a contractual obligation between two parties. I don't think incentive for the EPC companies at this stage would be advisable.
Understandable.
That's my
Yeah, understandable, sir. So, sir, with this, I would like to thank you all for the wonderful presentation and the question answer round. And I'm very sure,
Dora, if I can just as a thought that came to my mind, and in fact, the presentations were from Shrimano and Gauravji were quite interesting to really look at the amount of interest that the sector is bringing. Of course, as Vivek talked about the risk mitigation, yes, we together will have to mitigate the risk from every angle. From a regulatory perspective, we will do a bit from our end, whether it's priority sector lending, cash flow, organic manure, ease of doing business, and all others definitely will consider. But one more aspect which I think we should also focus, and that's a takeaway, is that can we create alternative markets rather than purely focusing on Satat? Can we look at the industry which requires huge amount of gas for their routine applications? And I see a lot of industries moving away from the conventional fuel to green fuels. There is a lot of international obligations that they are looking at, even if we're looking at whether they can replace their LPG with Bio-CNG, whether they can replace with CNG with the Bio-CNG. So I am sure with looking at the alternative markets, there can be an equal number of interesting contracts that can be signed, and that will also mitigate the risk over a period of time about purely focusing on the conventional route of selling it to oil companies. So that also should be a point to be considered, and whether it really makes interesting for the FIs to really look at this alternative market, RESCO models, CAPEX models, open access sales, all that will be evolved over a period of time, and that is where the innovation will come. I'm sure, I think with the amount of exposure that I could receive today from Chintan, Dr. Anil, Manav, Gaurav, and Vivek. I think it was really wonderful to get some very insights and the excitement that this particular business is creating across the world. So that was that I wanted to tell. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. I think now with this, I would like to formally hand it over to our president, Dr. A.R. Shukla, for his closing remarks and vote of thanks. Over to you, sir. We cannot hear you, sir, somehow. I think it's mute. Let me just check it out. So you can unmute yourself. It's still on mute, sir. It shows mute, self-muted. You need to, yeah, now it's okay.
Okay. Good. So thank you very much, Gaurav, for opportunity to directly face the experts this afternoon on behalf of Indian Biogas Association. And a lot of inputs have come, really, and they are going to help this sector a lot, as the Dale Sahab has said. The main thing which I would like to flag, because that has to be always borne in mind, is that this is the business of high risk. And high risk, much higher risk than the solar and wind. And therefore, the risk is to be mitigated. And that is what has been brought out this afternoon. Now, who is going to mitigate the risk? Obviously not the banks. Obviously not the financial institutions. Obviously not the other companies who are going to support it or fund it from outside the foreign investors. So therefore, this risk is to be mitigated, and we have to develop a mechanism. Either we say that it is not important, we leave it out on its fate, but if it is important, as the Dale Sahab has said, there are 9 outputs. I've been talking that this plant does the 3 outputs, and he has put all other things together. Now it has become 9 outputs. If it is so important, then somebody has to take the risk. And it has also been mentioned by the speaker this afternoon that the generation-based incentive is a better option, because there the commitment of the promoter is for the longer period of time. So as we did in our last webinar from the IB side, and we impressed upon 2 things mainly. It was the generation-based incentive over and above that of the Satat, about ₹20 per kg, and also creating the biogas fertilizer fund. There has to be a financing mechanism. And these 2 things are very, very important. And of course, as regards the biomass bulk aggregators and suppliers, all that is possible. It can be done. But ultimately, who is going to pay for it? The cost of CNG put by Satat, and with so many conditions, which I am really learned a lot today, it has become so tight that all the responsibility are for the promoters or the biogas generator, Bio-CNG generator themselves. And therefore, as a matter of fact, the oil marketing companies are not taking any risk. If your gas has been sold, then you will be getting your funds, your money back. How a business can run like this? However, so keeping that 46 rupees as the base price, it is now time that the risk is taken by the government. Nobody other than the government can take this risk. And it has put the policies in place so that there is a confidence in this sector. As Mr. Kapoor has rightly said, that there is no confidence. The policies are not, and also Mr. Jain has said, the policies are not there which are dependent upon. So therefore, just like for solar mission, bioenergy mission has also been suggested. We have been talking about it. Now, MNRE has earlier talked about the mission, but the mission did not see the day of the light of the day. Now, we can at least start with the GBI and the biogas fertilizer fund as a major policy push to it. Then the other things will follow, and the confidence will be there. Let it not be for 5 years, 3 years, or 8 years. What this startup is going to is doing in its program. Let it be for at least 15, 20 years time minimum, because it is rightly said that the plant life is 15 years minimum. So 15 to 20 years, the support mechanism, if it is there, then all the outputs which we have talked out, they will be coming. And as regards the fertilizer, rightly said that the price is not fixed. It cannot be fixed because that the buyer, that is the farmer, they cannot afford to buy it at a higher price. And therefore, the output from the biofertilizer side, it cannot be factored for a very, very high input for the revenue. Some people may talk some experiment here and there, some demonstration. They are selling at 6 rupees, 7 rupees, 8 rupees a kg organic fertilizer, but that is not going to be there at large if you are going to pay. So these were my general observations at the end to again say that let us take this collectively, of course, but the lead is to be taken from the government itself, from nobody else. So therefore, finally, I thank Mr. Jagdale, Mishra ji, our Manav Bansal ji from SBI Capital, Gaurav Kapoor ji, Sahab, and Mr. Jain. Really fantastic inputs all of you have provided. And we are, as a community, our Bio-CNG promoters are going to take it further and be benefited in future, in times to come. So thank you, Gaurav. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Gaurav?
That's it from our side. Yeah, thanks a lot, sir. That's it from our side. I mean, we have termed this webinar as Samanvay, Samvad, and Samadhan. Coordination, communication, and solution. So this is just another one, and this dialogue will be on. And we definitely look forward to achieve our goal. That's why we are working, and that's why we are together. In fact,
thanks, Gaurav, for the hard work of the entire team. Really, you have been working a lot to make it. This was a second, and you are third and fourth will also be coming. That's very good.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jagdale ji, Sahab, Mishra ji, Mr. Mano, Gaurav ji, and Vivek ji. Thanks, all of you, from our side with folded hands. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you, ji. Thank you,
Thank
Gaurav.
you. Thank you. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.